The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Dakota Territory like a widow's veil, soft and gray and melancholy. As Grace McKenna walked the dusty road toward the Thornfield Ranch with a heavy heart and an even heavier valise. The year was 1882, and at 26, she had already buried a husband, lost a farm to creditors, and spent her last dollar on the stagecoach ticket that brought her to this remote corner of the world where desperation masqueraded as opportunity. The advertisement in the Bismarck Tribune had been simple enough. Reliable woman needed for dairy work and household duties, room and board plus wages. Apply to J. Thornfield, Thornfield Ranch, 10 miles south of Medora. It wasn't the life Grace had dreamed of when she married sweet-natured Daniel McKenna 3 years ago. But dreams had a way of dying hard deaths on the frontier, and she had learned to be grateful for any honest work that would keep her fed and sheltered. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that the Thornfield Ranch sat in a valley so beautiful it made her chest ache with longing for things she couldn't name. Rolling grasslands stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by a meandering creek lined with cottonwoods and the weathered buildings of what was clearly a prosperous operation. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a wide porch that spoke of summer evenings and quiet contemplation, while the barn and outbuildings showed the careful maintenance of a man who took pride in his work. It was at the barn that Grace first encountered the herd of dairy cows that would become her responsibility. 20-odd Holstein and Jersey cows that regarded her with the placid curiosity of creatures accustomed to routine. They were beautiful animals, well cared for and healthy. Grace felt a flutter of genuine pleasure at the prospect of working with them. She had always had a way with animals, a gentle touch that seemed to calm even the most skittish creatures. What she hadn't expected was the man who emerged from the shadows of the barn like something conjured from her most secret dreams and darkest fears. Jacob Thornfield was tall and lean, with a kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of years spent under the open sky, his dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and his blue eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect both the vastness of the prairie and the weight of unspoken sorrows. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was something in his posture that spoke of loneliness, worn like an old coat, familiar and unnoticed until someone else pointed it out. "Miss McKenna, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who had learned to speak slowly and thoughtfully. "I'm Jacob Thornfield. Welcome to my ranch." Grace found herself staring, her carefully prepared introduction dying on her lips as recognition crashed over her like a cold wave. The years had changed him, had carved lines around his eyes, and added breadth to his shoulders. But she would have known those blue eyes anywhere. They were the same eyes that had looked at her with desperate love 12 years ago, the same eyes that had haunted her dreams through marriage and widowhood and all the long, lonely years between. "Jacob," she whispered, his name escaping her lips before she could stop it. His reaction was immediate and visceral. Color drained from his face, and his hand shot out to grip the barn wall, as if the earth had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. For a moment they stood frozen in time, two people staring at each other across a gulf of years and choices and bitter regret. "Grace Henderson," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My God, what are you doing here?" The question hung between them like an accusation, and Grace felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. She had known this moment was possible when she saw his name in the advertisement, had even wondered if it might be the same Jacob Thornfield who had once promised to love her forever. But knowing and experiencing were two entirely different things, and she found herself unprepared for the rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "I needed work," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I'm a widow now, Grace McKenna. My husband died last spring, and I lost everything when the bank foreclosed on our farm in Minnesota." Jacob's expression shifted, surprise and sympathy warring with something deeper and more complicated. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said formally, but she could hear the underlying current of pain in his voice. "You married Daniel McKenna then? I always wondered, ... The unfinished sentence hung between them, heavy with all the words they had never spoken, all the explanations that had come too late. Grace remembered the last time she had seen Jacob Thornfield. standing on the platform of the Chicago train station with tears streaming down his face as she boarded the eastbound train. With her family, she had been 18 and terrified, torn between love and duty. She had chosen duty because her parents had convinced her it was the only respectable choice for a young woman of good family. Jacob had been nobody then. A dirt farmer with nothing to offer but calloused hands and a heart full of dreams. Her father had forbidden the match, had threatened to disown her if she didn't come to her senses and marry the respectable banker's son he had chosen for her. In the end, Grace had bowed to pressure and convention, had told herself she was being practical and mature. She had married Harold Henderson 6 months later, had tried to be a good wife to a man she respected but didn't love. Harold had been kind enough, if distant, and when he died of consumption after 5 years of marriage, Grace had grieved for the life unlived more than for the man himself. Second marriage to Daniel McKenna had been built on companionship and mutual loneliness rather than passion, and though she had cared for him deeply, she had never stopped wondering what might have been if she had found the courage to choose love over security. "I didn't know you had settled in Dakota Territory," Grace said, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the weight of memory. "When I saw the name in the advertisement, I thought it might be you, but I wasn't certain. I came west after." Jacob paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "After Chicago. Figured there was nothing left for me back there, so I headed out to make a new start. Been here 8 years now, built this place up from nothing." He gestured toward the ranch buildings with a mixture of pride and something that might have been bitterness. "Turns out I had more to offer than your father thought." The words stung because they were true, and Grace could see in Jacob's eyes that he knew exactly how much his success would have meant to her family all those years ago. The irony was cruel and perfect. He had become exactly the kind of man her parents would have approved of, but only after she had given up hope of ever seeing him again. "Oh, Jacob," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't apologize or explain or try to make sense of any of us. What's done is done, and we're both different people now." He straightened his shoulders, and Grace could see him pulling on the armor of polite indifference, like a familiar garment. "The question is whether you still want the job, knowing who I am." Grace looked around the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings and healthy livestock, the signs of prosperity and careful management. She thought of her dwindling savings, her uncertain future, the long list of rejections she had received from other potential employers, who found various reasons not to hire a young widow with no family connections. More than that, though, she thought of the man standing before her, the boy she had loved with the desperate intensity of first love transformed into someone harder and more self-contained, but still recognizably the Jacob who had once promised to love her until the stars fell from the sky. Working for him would be torture, a daily reminder of the choice she had made and the life she had thrown away. But walking away would be worse, would mean losing him again just when fate had unexpectedly offered them a second chance. "I need the work," she said finally, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. "And you need someone too. Manage your dairy operation. If you can put the past aside for the sake of business, so can I." Jacob studied her face for a long moment, and Grace had the unsettling feeling. He could see straight through her careful composure to the tangle of regret and longing beneath. "Very well," he said at last. "The job pays $30 a month, plus room and board. You'll have the small cabin behind the main house, and your duties will include milking, butter making, cheese production, and general household management. I'll expect you to start tomorrow morning at 5. "That's acceptable," Grace replied, though the thought of living in such close proximity to Jacob made her stomach flutter with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Good. Mrs. Patterson in town can vouch for my character if you have concerns about the propriety of the arrangement. She's been trying to find me a suitable wife for years, so she'll be delighted to know I've finally hired some domestic help." The mention of marriage hit Grace like a physical blow, though she tried not to let it show. Of course, Jacob Wu. LDB considering marriage, he was 30 years old, successful, and undoubtedly one of the most eligible bachelors in the territory. The thought of watching him court another woman, of preparing his house for a bride who wasn't her, made her chest tight with an emotion she refused to name. "I see," she managed. "Well, I'm sure Mrs. Patterson will find you someone suitable." "I'm sure she will," Jacob agreed, but something in his tone suggested the prospect brought him little joy. "Let me show you to your cabin. You'll want to get settled before supper." The cabin was small, but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, and a table by the single window that looked out over the creek. It was clearly a space that had been prepared with care, furnished with simple but well-made pieces and stocked with basic necessities. Grace set down her valise and turned to find Jacob watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. After months of uncertainty and temporary lodgings, the little cabin felt like a haven. "Thank you, suppers." "At 6, Jacob said. "We'll eat in the main house until you're settled. Then you can cook for yourself if you prefer." He hesitated, then added Grace. "I know this is awkward for both of us, but I want you to know that you'll be treated with respect here. Whatever happened between us in the past, you're under my protection now." The formal words stung more than anger or coldness would have, creating a distance between them that felt wider than the 12 years they had spent apart. But Grace nodded gracefully, understanding the boundaries he was trying to establish. "Appreciate that, Mr. Thornfield. I give you my word that I won't let personal history interfere with my work." "Good," he said, but his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than was strictly professional. "I'll see you at supper then." After he left, Grace sank onto the narrow bed and allowed herself the luxury of tears she had been holding back since. The moment she recognized him, the boy she had loved had grown into a man of substance and character. Exactly the kind of man she had always known he could become if given the chance. And she was here, not as his equal, not as his chosen partner, but as his employee, dependent on his charity and goodwill for her very survival. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. Her parents had refused to consider Jacob as a suitor because he had no prospects, no fortune, no social standing. Now he had all those things and more, while she had lost everything: her social position, her financial security, even her name. She was no longer Grace Henderson of the prominent Henderson family, or even Grace McKenna, respectable farmer's wife. She was just Grace, a widow who milked cows for a living. But as she unpacked her few possessions and tried to make the cabin feel like home, Grace found herself thinking not of what she had lost, but of what she might yet gain. She was here, in the same valley as the man she had never stopped loving, breathing the same air and watching the same sunsets. It wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of during her loneliest moments, but it was more than she had dared hope for. When she boarded the westbound stage in Minneapolis, perhaps it would be enough. The first weeks at the Thornfield Ranch passed in a blur of early mornings and hard work that left Grace too exhausted for much introspection. She threw herself into her duties with the fervor of a woman trying to prove herself, rising before dawn to milk the cows, spending her days churning butter and pressing cheese, managing the hen house and maintaining the vegetable garden that would help feed the ranch through the coming winter. Jacob was a fair but distant employer, treating her with unfailing courtesy, but maintaining the careful reserve he had established on her first day. They worked around each other like planets, in separate orbits, aware of each other's presence, but never allowing their paths to cross more than necessary. He took his meals in the main house while she ate in her cabin, spoke to her only when ranch business required it, seemed determined to prove that her presence had no effect on him whatsoever. It was a convincing performance, but Grace caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his blue eyes holding an expression that made her heart race and her hands tremble as she tried to focus on her work. There were moments when he helped her carry heavy buckets, when their fingers brushed as he handed her tools, when he asked after her comfort with a gentleness that seemed to slip past his defenses, that she glimpsed the man he had been. Before life and disappointment had taught him to guard his heart so carefully, the loneliness of it was almost unbearable. To be so close to him, to see him every day and speak with him and exist in his world, but to be separated by walls of propriety and painful history was a special kind of torture. Grace found herself lying awake at nights in her narrow bed, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods and wondering if Jacob was awake too. wondering if he felt the same ache of longing that kept her tossing and turning until dawn. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally broke through the careful equilibrium they had established, appearing at the ranch on a crisp October morning with a wagon full of supplies and a smile that didn't quite hide her calculating eyes. She was a plump, motherly woman in her 50s who had appointed herself the unofficial matchmaker for every bachelor within 50 miles. And Grace could see her mind working as she took in the domestic arrangements at the Thornfield Ranch. "You're the young woman Jacob hired to help with the dairy," Mrs. Patterson said, looking Grace up and down with frank curiosity. "I have to say, when he told me he was hiring a woman for the position, I had imagined someone ... older." "Mrs. Patterson," Grace replied mildly. "Hardly a girl." "Oh, my dear. 26 is the prime of life for a woman," Mrs. Patterson said with a laugh. "And a widow, Jacob tells me. How tragic to lose your husband so young. But you're still young enough to marry again, to have children. Have you given any thought to remarrying?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, acutely aware that Jacob was within earshot. Loading supplies for Mrs. Patterson's wagon, "I'm focused on my work right now, Mrs. Patterson. I haven't given much thought to anything else." "Well, you should," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "A woman needs a husband, especially out here on the frontier. It's not natural for a young woman to live alone, even with employment. Now, there are several eligible men in town who might be interested in a refined lady like yourself. There's Mr. Jameson, who owns the general store, and young Dr. Mitchell just arrived from Boston, ... Mrs. Patterson. Jacob's voice cut through the conversation, quiet but carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "Miss McKenna's personal affairs are her own business." "Of course they are," Mrs. Patterson agreed cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. "I'm just trying to be helpful. A woman in her position needs guidance, especially if she's new to the territory." Grace wanted to sink through the ground. The last thing she needed was Mrs. Patterson's well-meaning interference, especially with Jacob listening to every word. But before she could formulate a response, Jacob spoke again. "Miss McKenna is perfectly capable of managing her own affairs," he said firmly. "She doesn't need anyone's guidance, but her own good judgment." There was something in his tone that made both women look at him sharply. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose, and Grace felt her pulse quicken at the protective note in his voice. For a moment, the careful distance he had maintained seemed to crack, revealing something raw and possessive underneath. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, her eyes moving between Grace and Jacob with new interest. "Well, of course she is. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." An awkward silence fell over the group, broken only when Jacob announced he had work to do and strode off toward the barn with more haste than dignity. Mrs. Patterson watched him go, then turned to Grace with a speculative look that made Grace distinctly uncomfortable. "Interesting," Mrs. Patterson murmured. "Very interesting indeed." After Mrs. Patterson left, Grace found herself unable to concentrate on her work. Jacob's defense of her had been unexpected and revealing, suggesting that his careful indifference was more fragile than she had assumed. She caught herself watching for him, hoping for a chance to thank him or at least acknowledge what had passed between them. But he seemed to be avoiding her even more deliberately than usual. It was late that evening when she finally encountered him, stepping out of her cabin to fetch water from the well and nearly colliding with him in the darkness. He steadied her with hands that lingered on her arms a moment longer than necessary, and in the moonlight she could see the conflict warring in his expression. "Grace," he said softly, her name a caress in the darkness. "I wanted to apologize for Mrs. Patterson's behavior today. She means well, but she can be ... intrusive." "You don't need to apologize," Grace replied, acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his hand still resting on her arms. "And thank you for defending me. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "I may not have the right to protect you anymore, but I'll be damned if I'll stand by and watch someone treat you with anything less than the respect you deserve." The words hung between them like a bridge, fragile but real, and Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "Jacob ... don't," he said, but his hands tightened on her arms, betraying his own struggle.
Oh.
"Don't say anything that will make this harder than it already is." "Harder than what?" Grace whispered, stepping closer despite every rational thought telling her to retreat. Harder than pretending we don't know each other? Harder than acting like there was never anything between us? Yes, Jacob said desperately, because there can't be anything between us now. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. You're my employee, Grace, and I'm your what? She challenged, lifting her chin to meet his eyes directly. You're the man I've never stopped loving. The man I think about every night when I lie alone in that cabin. The man I gave up once because I was too much of a coward to fight for what I wanted. Jacob's breath caught, and for a moment Grace thought he might pull her into his arms and damn the consequences. But then his hands fell away, and he stepped back, rebuilding the walls between them with visible effort. You're my employee, he repeated firmly, and that's all you can be. The rejection hit Grace like a physical blow, but instead of retreating, she found herself growing angry. Why? She demanded. Because it's not proper. Because people might talk. I've spent my entire life letting other people's opinions dictate my choices, Jacob, and where has it gotten me? I'm 26 years old, I've buried 2 husbands, and I've never once followed my own heart. I won't make that mistake again. What about my heart? Jacob shot back, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I don't lie awake at night remembering what it felt like to hold you, to kiss you, to plan a future that never happened? You left, Grace. You chose someone else, and I had to live with that for 12 years. I won't put myself through that again. The pain in his voice broke Grace's heart, but it also kindled a fierce determination she hadn't felt since she was 18 and desperately in love. I didn't choose someone else, she said quietly. I chose what I thought was expected of me, what I thought was safe. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Jacob stared at her, his chest rising and falling with emotions he was fighting to control. It doesn't matter now, he said finally. You're here because you need work, not because you want to be with me. And when something better comes along, when one of Mrs. Patterson's eligible bachelors catches your fancy, you'll leave again. I won't survive that twice. Before Grace could respond, Jacob turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the moonlight with tears streaming down her face and a heart full of words. She hadn't been fast enough to say, the confrontation changed everything between them. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by a tension that crackled in the air whenever they were in the same space. Jacob became even more distant, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary and avoiding any situation that might leave them alone together. Grace, for her part, found herself caught between hurt and determination. Torn between respecting his wishes and fighting for what she wanted, winter settled over the Dakota Territory with brutal efficiency. A frozen wasteland and driving both humans and animals into whatever shelter they could find. The ranch work became a matter of survival rather than prosperity, focused on keeping the livestock alive and the buildings warm. Grace and Jacob were forced into closer proximity by the harsh weather, working together to break ice on water troughs and haul feed to animals that couldn't venture outside. It was during a particularly brutal blizzard in January that the fragile equilibrium between them finally shattered. Grace had been struggling to reach the barn through waist-deep snow when she lost her footing and fell, twisting her ankle and finding herself unable to get back up. The wind was howling with such ferocity that her cries for help were lost in the storm. She realized with growing panic that she might freeze to death within sight of the barn. It was Jacob who found her, merging from the white chaos like an avenging angel, his face stark with fear as he gathered her into his arms and carried her to safety. By the time they reached the main house, Grace was shaking with cold and shock, and Jacob was cursing himself with a fluency that would have impressed a cavalry sergeant. Damn it, Grace, what were you thinking going out in weather like this? He demanded as he set her down by the fireplace and began stripping off her wet clothes with hands that shook with emotion rather than cold. You could have died out there. The cows needed to be milked. Grace protested through chattering teeth, too grateful to be alive to take offense at his rough handling. They were in pain. The cows can damn well wait, Jacob growled, wrapping her in blankets and pulling her closer to the fire. Nothing is worth risking your life. He knelt beside her, his hands moving over her with professional efficiency as he checked for signs of frostbite. But Grace could see the fear in his eyes, the barely controlled panic that spoke of emotions too deep to hide. When his fingers found the swollen ankle, she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Jacob leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. And what if I said I felt the same way? What if I told you that seeing you again has turned my whole world upside down, that I can't sleep or eat or think of anything but you? Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. I'd say it's about time one of us was brave enough to admit it. What if I said I wanted to court you properly this time? To do things right instead of just stealing kisses in the moonlight like we did when we were young? I'd say that sounds like the most wonderful thing in the world, Grace replied, tears streaming down her face. Jacob rose from his chair and crossed to the sofa, kneeling beside her with the same reverence he might have shown in church. Grace. Henderson McKenna, he said formally, his voice thick with emotion. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you with the intention of making you my wife? Yes, Grace whispered, reaching up to cup his face with trembling hands. Yes, Jacob Thornfield, I would be honored to be courted by you. When he kissed her, it was with 12 years of longing and regret and desperate hope, a kiss that tasted of second chances and dreams deferred but not destroyed. Grace melted into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she still fit against him, how right it felt to be held by the man she had never stopped loving. I love you, she whispered against his lips. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. I love you too, Jacob replied, his voice rough with emotion, and this time, I'm never letting you go. As spring returned to the Dakota Territory, transforming the frozen landscape into a carpet of wildflowers and new grass, Grace and Jacob planned their wedding with the joy of two people who had learned not to take happiness for granted. Mrs. Patterson, who had appointed herself wedding coordinator despite never being asked, bustled around the ranch with lists and decorations and enough enthusiasm to power a steam engine. It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard, she declared for the 100th time as she supervised the decoration of the barn for the reception. Childhood sweethearts reunited after 12 years apart. It's like something out of a novel, Grace smiled and continued arranging wildflowers in mason jars, her engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that Jacob had ordered from Chicago, catching the sunlight streaming through the barn doors. The ring wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was chosen with love and given freely, which made it more precious than any jewel. I just hope the weather holds, she said, glancing toward the open doors where she could see Jacob and several neighbors setting up tables and chairs. It would be just like spring to surprise us with a blizzard. The weather will be perfect, Mrs. Patterson said confidently. I can feel it in my bones. Besides, after everything you two have been through, you deserve a perfect day. As if summoned by their conversation, Jacob appeared in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair disheveled from work, but wearing the smile that had become as natural as breathing since their engagement. How are my two favorite ladies doing? Your future wife is worrying about the weather, Mrs. Patterson reported. I keep telling her it's going to be beautiful. Mrs. Patterson's right, Jacob said, crossing to Grace and pulling her into his arms despite Mrs. Patterson's presence. Tomorrow is going to be perfect, because I'm finally going to marry the woman I've loved my whole life. Grace felt her cheeks warm, still not entirely used to the open affection Jacob showed her now that they were engaged. After months of careful distance and hidden longing, his willingness to touch her and kiss her and declare his love publicly still felt like a miracle. Saving all the romance for the wedding day, I see, Mrs. Patterson said with a laugh. Well, I suppose I should leave you two alone to moon at each other. I need to check on the cake anyway. After she bustled off, Jacob pulled Grace closer, his expression growing serious. Any second thoughts? He asked quietly. Because if you're having any doubts at all, now's the time to say so. Grace reached up to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. No second thoughts, she said firmly. No doubts, no fears. Just love and excitement and gratitude that we found our way back to each other. Good, Jacob said, bending to kiss her softly. Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret choosing. Love, Grace replied, her voice full of quiet conviction. I spent 12 years regretting not choosing it. I won't make that mistake again. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with a soft breeze that carried the scent of prairie roses and new beginnings. Grace stood in the little cabin that had been her home for nearly a year. Wearing her mother's wedding dress that had been carefully altered to fit her, felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. This was right. This was what she was meant to do? Who she was meant to be? Not Grace Henderson, the banker's wife, who had lived a life of quiet desperation. Or Grace McKenna, the farmer's wife, who had settled for companionship instead of passion. She was Grace Thornfield, the rancher's wife who had chosen love over security, hope over fear, and her own happiness over the world's expectations. When Jacob saw her walking down the makeshift aisle between rows of chairs filled with neighbors and friends, his face lit up with such joy that several people in the assembled crowd dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. He was magnificent in his best suit, tall and handsome, and looking at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had ever uttered. The ceremony itself was simple, but heartfelt. Conducted by the traveling preacher who made the rounds of the scattered communities, but when they spoke their vows, looking into each other's eyes and promising to love and honor and cherish until death parted them, Grace felt the healing of old wounds and the birth of new dreams. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced. And Jacob needed no further encouragement. The kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, witnessed by a crowd that erupted in cheers and applause. As they broke apart, Jacob rested his forehead against Grace's and whispered, "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornfield." "I've been home since the day I walked into your barn," Grace replied, her voice thick with tears of joy. "I just didn't know it yet." The reception lasted well into the evening, with dancing and music and enough food too,